anybody there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Hey, Tommy, good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Oh, I'm well. I'm Jaime. Great to meet
Hi,
you.
nice to meet you too.
Well, Tommy, I'm very excited to get to talk to you today. You are a flash fiction and a master of the short form, if I may say, according to what the internet tells me and what your stories tell me. So it's really a pleasure to get to talk to you because it's something that I'm very fond of, and I just can't wait to learn where you're from and sort of where that magic comes from. Can you tell me where you're from?
Well, right now I live in a tiny town called Warsaw, Indiana. There's about 15,000 people. We're about an hour south of South Bend.
Mm.
If anyone knows anything about Indiana, it's probably Indianapolis, which we're 2.5 hours north of there, or South Bend, where Notre Dame is from. Um, and actually, I grew up about 10 minutes from here in an even smaller town called Etna Green, which only had like 600 people or something. Yeah, very small, very Midwestern, very much not usually people doing a lot of writing necessarily, especially trying to, make a career or a literary career out of it. In fact, when I was going to go off to undergrad, my plan was to be a lawyer. Um, but I realized, that I've always been a reader, but then I fell in love with a short story class in undergrad and decided to see if I could do what writers were doing for me when they were writing their stories in their books. So uh, I decided not to be a lawyer,
Good
which I
plan.
think I'm better off for. Yeah, right.
Well, it seems like there is some connective tissue between being a lawyer and the arts to me. I have a lot of actor friends who tend to go into being attorneys and lawyers, and I'm curious what that is. Maybe it's just the presentation aspect of it or the narrative aspect of it, I suppose. That kind of made
Yeah.
sense to you back then?
Yeah, I think like probably a lot of people that want to be lawyers. I watched probably a lot of like Law and Order, and I thought that that's like what it was, and like that's really good storytelling. I mean, it may have lost its way a little bit and got a little cheesy in the long run, but like for a lot of people, like that is very genre lawyer type fiction, and I think I really like the idea of telling a story to a crowd of people, jurors, and trying to convince people that I wanted to be a prosecutor, and I think that's the other
Mm.
reason why I decided not to be a lawyer. So I actually don't see the world in black and white. I see it very gray, which helps a lot when you're building or trying to build empathetic characters. But I think I just fell in love with that idea of like I'm going to tell a story and I'm going to convince you that my way is right. And then when you're young like that, you think you're right anyway, right? And it takes a while as you get older to get empathy for other other people. So I started to want to tell other kind of stories, I guess.
Yeah. And I'm curious, being a small town person myself, what that environment does to your perspective, especially when you're perhaps having time to observe the world around you a bit more than other folks. Do you feel like it's something that informed your writing right away, being from a small town and having that perspective of the Midwest, maybe?
I guess that's an interesting question. I think in some ways, like the thing about small towns is we think we know everything about everybody, but we don't, right? So I think there's that room and that gap for writers to really to investigate this idea of thinking that we know everyone or know at least something about someone, but we generally don't usually know the stories that got people to where they are now, or what jobs they took, or what relationships they had, or
Hmm.
what marriages and those kind of things. I do think in some ways you miss out, like, if you're not riding a train every day, where you could observe people kind of on the train, it's a different kind of way. Like you're fully kind of immersed in being around people in some ways. Like in cities, obviously you're around people all the time, but it's so quickly moving that you're just getting flashes of people. But I think in smaller towns, like you're kind of expected to know something about everyone. And again, I think there's some real tension to that I hadn't really thought about before. That like, if you ask me about a certain person from high school, I probably have a story about them. But we know, like, especially as writers, like that's not really who they are. That one story that I formed. Although that's the way I write, right? Like I write flash fiction because I want to tell one story about one character in one very important moment in their life. And so maybe subtly, subconsciously, the small town kind of put that into me in some ways, or it's just a curiosity, I guess, about people in some ways too. Like I think a lot of times small town gossip again wants to frame people in one way, but I want to know more than that. One way about a person. So yeah, I think it has influenced me in some ways. Not that it's right or wrong to live in a small town or a big
Sure.
city or what have you. I mean, there's definitely some graces to being in a small atmosphere, but there's also a lot of times a lack of culture in a lot of ways, a lack of diversity in a lot of ways, and so there's sometimes not a richness in smaller towns that you might be able to get from a bigger city. Like if you really want to have more interaction with culture and other people's thoughts and stuff, like you have to get out of your small town. You could just get landlocked, you know?
Very much so. And I wanted to expand on that for just a moment. When you went to college, what was that opening of experience like for you, if you can describe that moment?
Yeah, in some ways it wasn't that much because like the where I went to undergrad was only an hour away. I wanted to stay close to home at that point. I wish I had branched out more, but I just wasn't ready. But you know, it was only a town of 30,000 people, and then my college I think only had like 6,000 people or something.
Mm.
Although the diversity range had increased quite a bit, which was really nice. I love to play basketball, and I've always played basketball, and so it was really nice to play basketball with a lot of different people than I wouldn't have been at my small town park or what have you.
Yeah.
But also they had a really rich kind of liberal arts. It was a kind of a private school or whatever experience, which in some ways was a lot more expensive. But I think we were bringing in some books that like I had not touched in high school in a lot of ways. We had the autobiography of Frederick Douglass that I read right away my freshman year, which I think it was really good to kind of grasp that situation that he was going through. We read The Things They Carry by Tim O'Brien. He came on campus. Like, that was a big deal for me in a lot of ways, too. Like, here are people or writers that were experiencing way different things than I was. And, like, that's the power of books, right? Is to give us the ability to kind of walk in the shoes of people that are different than us and have the chance to be empathetic in situations that we may or may never face. It's one of the reasons why I think I became a writer. Is I wanted to live as many lives as I could, and I wanted to create those lives. So I do think the college experience, in a lot of ways, broadened me from a very kind of small and shallow kind of high school experience. And so I'm grateful for
Yeah.
that. I think in a lot of ways, like I probably should have taken it even further, but you know, we all have to kind of go through these steps um, as we grow older.
Yeah, and I want to thank you for articulating the small town point of view so well that it almost gave me flashbacks. I don't know if it was a core memory, a good or bad one, but it that same ability that you had to have this extreme empathy because you're in a small town was maybe a source of my personal anxieties when I was younger. And
Yeah,
so that's just such a beautiful way to put it because you do have a choice to branch out even in those towns and then get proximate to the humanity of people rather than be recoiled by, what may not be a decent bunch of people sometimes. Because in small towns, there
right.
there are some of those folks. Now, when you were in your fiction class, can you tell me what that was like discovering this form that has been with you for
Yeah,
so
yeah,
long?
absolutely. It's a great, like I said, I've read since forever, and I love to read. It's my first passion, and like if writing went away, like I'd still be reading for sure. And I think like I got to that class and I was like, oh, I can't do this, but I'm gonna try it anyway. And then like I wrote some really bad short stories, like really bad, but like it touched a certain kind of nerve or a certain kind of thinking that maybe I wasn't experiencing before. to think in narrative and think in scenes and think in images that I had, but I hadn't actually utilized in a lot of ways besides just, visualizing it while I was reading. And one of the crazy things, not crazy, but one of the weird things was that they used the sudden fiction anthology, the first one that came out in like 1986. And so I got to experience a lot of what they were calling then like short shorts, which is now kind of like flash fiction today. Um, when I would not have ever experienced that before. Like I was reading, like John Grisham and maybe some Lord of the Rings here or there, but like it was very like poppy lawyer genre type books. And then this book just really opened my eyes to literature. Because from there I went to like Carver. Still was reading some Stephen King, which is kind of on the lines there and stuff like that. Um, but there was this story by Elizabeth Talent called "No One's a Mystery" that just floored me. I was like, oh, I want to try to do this. Like, how do I write a story that I understand who these two characters are in 800 words? Like, how did she do that? But like, it was just, yeah, a great book about this guy that was kind of having an affair with a younger girl. He gives her a diary. He makes her get at the bottom of the floor well of the truck as he passes his wife. Like, as a 20-year-old, this is like not something that like I was experiencing by any means, but like I understood who these people were in just like this 5-minute piece of story.
Yeah.
Um, And so from there, like I think it took me a little while to be like, oh, this is kind of like my thing. Like I was still trying to write, longer short stories. When I went to my MFA program, I wrote 142 pages of a novel that's not finished. I don't know if it'll ever be finished. Uh, so I've tried on these other longer kind of forms. But really the start was that sudden fiction book, and then like I said, moving on to like Raymond Carver as well. In those stories that have kind of we know now have been were kind of shrunk by the editor, but at the time like that was kind of like the short shorts for me.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. And having the pleasure of reading your recent one that was nominated for Microfictions 2023, it was the love story of the parents, and the title escapes me here for a moment, but
Yeah, I'm trying to think about it. It's the maneuverings of a tilting
yes.
planet or something close to that,
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely. And clearly you have such output that it's difficult to trace back some of these things, which is wonderful, and I'm excited to hear about your process there. But one of the fascinating things about that story, and I urge people to take a look at that one, it has a muscular energy in the way that you write this, because immediately the hook is so strong, because it's almost like traveling back in time in the first three sentences, that is so magnetic that by the time you get to the meat of it, which is that relationship of the parents, it's something that is so powerful and moving, and every little bit of it is necessary, and there is nothing additional, nothing needed, but it's so poetic and really beautiful at the end there. And, for one, congratulations, but secondly, how's the construction of something like this come to you? Like, for example, that story, if we could talk about that one, if you can
Yeah,
recall.
I can. Yeah. Thank you so much for your very kind words. Like that really is what like that's what I think Flash is, right? Nothing extra. Hopefully this urgency and this velocity to it. Not all Flash has to be that way, but that's what I try to do with my Flash. It's just kind of the way that I think of Propel. So thank you, because that's exactly what I'm trying to do. Most of my stories start with the first line. If I get a really, really good first line, that's the thing that usually pops into my head. I might be sitting around and my mind's just jogging through some things, and that first line just comes to me, which is kind of weird, but that's just the way my brain thinks. And I'm so glad that I have a passion and a facility to actually put it on paper and not just have it be stuck in my head. But without that first line, I usually don't get off the page, which I think is another reason why I stick to Flash or very short things. This thing, I think, is only 250 words, which is even pretty small for me. So, like, to write a whole like novel or a whole long short story this way would almost be impossible. It'd be exhausting. I worked with a writer once, and they were just starting Flash, and they had written like a first full story, and they were like, when they were done, they were exhausted, and I was like, yeah, a lot of times you are, because you're really pushing your brain to kind of keep up with your fingers, or your fingers to keep up with your brain. And I try to stay in the moment with those characters from the second that I write that first line. This is one of the stories that once the first line came, I was like, you know what? I'm really going to be consciously trying to push the language. I am not a poet by any means. Every once in a while, people are like, maybe you should write poetry, but I really like the narrative aspect. Not that you can't
Yeah.
write narrative poetry, but I think poetry has kind of an obsession with a line or an image, where stories kind of have, at least I hope, an obsession with the narrative, like what is happening from front to back, or from beginning to end. Even if we're not getting a full, Freytag's triangle version of the plot diagram, which I don't think Flash needs. I think that's one of the powers of Flash, is that you can cut some of that stuff out and it still be a full story. I just want to, I want to write as much of a narrative as I can. And so for this one, and I don't remember, it's been a little while since I've read it, and sometimes they go away because I have written, several stories since then. But I do remember, like having this line and a certain way of telling the story that maybe I hadn't used before, and just really pushing as much as I could out. And I think I wrote most of this in one setting. I think I might have revised a bit, but this is just one of those ones that, like, I knew it was going to be short because of how hard I was pushing the language. And how much I was just sitting in the moment of this situation and trying to finish it before I left the chair. Because there are moments when you just want to be like, oh, this is getting into like territory where I'm just so almost done. But like if I take one wrong step, maybe I could wreck it. And really, you can't wreck it because you can always go back. But there's just this feeling of being in that moment, in that story, while I'm writing it, that I want to maintain for as long as possible.
Yeah, and you bring up something that reminds me of something that I've done in the past too, which is the last sitting. Usually I write plays, so I it takes me a little bit longer, and the sessions take a bit, but it becomes a matter of solving the puzzle in one sitting, as if you were doing like a Sudoku or some like a crossword puzzle,
Yeah.
and you're seeing those things just kind of fit in the way that they need to. But I love that in this piece there was characterization for everyone within that poetry, within the conceptual, framework of this thing. You still had the right words for the brothers fighting and the holding hands of the parents that fell like a leaf, and it was just so elegant that I think I was just amazed that the humanity was just as good as the framework of it. And I think
Oh,
that
thank you.
some people are have difficulty with one or the other, right? I
Right.
find that I myself am more of a conceptual sort of writer, and so that's kind of my way in. But for you, it seems like first and foremost, the humanity of the character has to be the point of attack, right?
Yeah, yeah, I'm not really a conceptual writer in a lot of ways. There is no right or wrong, whatever your process is and whatever gets you into the story. But I definitely, yes, am versed in characters first. And usually, like I said, it comes to that first line. Either they're saying something to me or there's an image of them doing something. I like to start in action as much as possible, which is another reason why I'm not necessarily a conceptual writer, because I think sometimes with concepts, like, you really have to write it out before you, the writer, knows what the concept is. And I just put characters in action, and hope that what they're doing will lead me to somewhere interesting. The other thing that I think that is really difficult about Flash, but what I love, I don't like exposition really at all, just for whatever reason. Like, there's times when you absolutely need it, especially in longer works, which is why I don't do longer works as well, I think, because I don't necessarily give the context that a longer work of a reader wants. I'm just putting many brushstrokes in, and I don't need to fully understand every little minutia of a character to put those brushstrokes in. So I'm giving you just what I'm understanding about that character in that moment as well, right or wrong. And when a Flash kind of fails or doesn't coalesce or doesn't come together, it's usually because I haven't quite figured out that mini brushstroke to create that character, or that mini action that they're going to do. I was in an MFA once, workshop, and they wanted to know something about some characters because it was a longer work. And I said, I don't know. And the instructor was like, hey, you really have to know. And I was like, oh, do I? And for a longer work, in some ways, I think you do need to know. But for Flash, I think part of the creation of the characters is the ambiguity, and kind of what we talked about before in the small town way. Like, you don't know everything about everyone, and just because they're in a story doesn't mean you're going to know everything about them either. You only
Mm,
get to know what you know in this moment. And so I think it's another reason why I love Flash is like, I actually don't need to know everything about these characters to hopefully build them on the page in this moment. But I do think in a longer story, in some ways, you do kind of have to know a lot more context, especially a novel, right? A novel is all about context, and it's
right.
all about the characters' feelings and those kind of things. And so I think that's probably one of the reasons why I keep writing Flash and not a novel. Is I don't always want to go into the head of the character. I want the reader to be a teammate in making inferences for what's on the page.
Mm. There is that element of almost a conversation between the reader, it more so than the longer works. But I'm curious of works that you've written in the past that have informed the way that you write now, because obviously the writer evolves, the writer learns by trial and error. But have there been some pivotal lessons in some Flash pieces in the past that really changed or informed your decision making, or maybe the process?
It's such a great question, and I will try to figure it out in some ways, because I think in some ways, like, we kind of know our process, and in some ways, like, to explain our process is kind of hard too, because, like, if we knew it so well, then maybe it wouldn't be our process, if that makes sense. I will say, like, most people, like, in undergrad and even MFA, like, I wrote some, like, really bad, longer stories that just didn't have tension because I was trying to know so much about the characters, and I was trying to provide the reader so much about them, that I was using a lot more exposition. I wasn't necessarily pushing the language the way that I love to do in Flash. The longer the work, the harder it is to push the language as well. Not that you can't in a short story, but or a novel even. There are people like Garth Greenwell, or is that his last name, who writes just beautifully in longer works, or Alexander Chi. But for the most part, like, writing in longer works is more a little more. I don't want to say pedestrian because I don't think that's fair. It's kind of pejorative. Uh, it's to the point so that you can get your characters doing what they're doing and thinking what they're thinking. So for me, I think one of the things that really opened it up for me is figuring out how to use figurative language and metaphor. I think almost really the shorter the work, the more it has to have some kind of central or commanding metaphor in order to build that context that I'm leaving out from exposition. I worked with Sarah Fraley, who is a Flash writer and poet, and she talked about metaphors moving up and down kind of vertically, and similes kind of moving horizontally across the page. And I love similes. Oh my gosh, when I was in undergrad, I wrote so many bad similes. Like, I would just fill the pages with similes. Like, at first I was like, oh, this is a gift. Look at this. And then I was like, oh, here's a 5-page story that's got 25 similes. Like, no one wants to read that, right? There's no way you can compare that many things. And so now with Flash, I really try to find a central image or metaphor. And one of the ways that I think Flash works is to give this image or metaphor in the beginning and then shift it by the end, either at least once or twice. The rule of three is a little corny, but it really does work in storytelling. Like, our brains really do work and really do want to see things shift from beginning to end. And that's one way to kind of create movement. It's also something that's kind of helped me, like I said, focus on the characters and their experience in that moment instead of telling everything that I might want to tell about them. And so my process really has been trying to discover the metaphor that really cements the story to the page. And if I don't find that metaphor, then sometimes the Flash just doesn't work. But one of the things I like about Flash is that, I can generally write a full draft in like 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours. And like, if it doesn't work, I can just leave it there and come back to it later if something comes to me. But if something never comes, then like, how much have I really wasted? Nothing, right? Because I'll just try another one the next day.
You've mentioned two things that really blow my mind. One is the metaphor concept here that completely blows my mind, because 10 years ago I was at a playwriting workshop, and hosted by a dramaturg, Jocelyn Clark, and he mentioned the same exact thing, but for playwriting. He said the play is the metaphor, and you need to make sure that it evolves, that it has a shift, that something occurs within that that just offers a transformation, much like what the character is going to go through. And that is so fascinating that something like that positively works, because I've known this to be effective in plays as well. And that kind of through line is just kind of a mark of efficiency, to have something to just completely center the piece and then evolve that way. But in terms of efficiency as well in your life, it seems like you're very interested in being efficient as well. Do you, how does that work being a father, because you have kids, right? Yeah. And having, oh wow, yeah, and having other occupations while being productive, while making this work, as a writer. Can you tell me a bit about how you find that efficiency and how you remain effective?
Yeah, and I think in a lot of ways, no writing is wasted, right? Like that's just kind of a negative mindset that I have
Mhm.
myself. I mean, every time you come to the page, like hopefully in some ways you're improving. Or I was talking to a writer the other day that I was working with, like this might like they wrote a story that wasn't quite working. I said this might be the thing that just gets you to the next story, and you always have to be on the lookout for the fact that like every time you write doesn't mean that it's publishable. That's the same for me as well. Like sometimes I write like a bad story, but it may lead me to the next metaphor for the next story, or it may lead me to another character or some other kind of thought or something. And sometimes we just sit down and we need to get something on the page to make us feel whole, balanced, better. And it doesn't always mean that it's publishable. And that can be a really hard lesson to learn. And I'm still learning it. Like I'm trying to learn how to be patient. When I first started, I just wanted to write them as quick as I could, get them
Mm.
out as quick as I could, get them published, and kind of build that idea of what publishing looked like and those kind of things. And now I'm trying to be a little more patient, a little more meticulous in some ways. That like I do have time. You know what I mean? I think
Hmm.
that's the biggest currency that a writer has is time. So in a lot of ways, it was when I first started writing, especially once I had finished undergrad, finished my MFA, and I was working. My wife is a fourth grade teacher, so we're trying to balance a household and all that kind of stuff. And then my
Mm.
daughter was born in 2011. Was just coming and sitting down whenever I had the opportunity that didn't necessarily affect everyone else's life as well. Uh, by no means am I a perfect spouse or a perfect parent by any means, but we really do try to share the load as much as possible, knowing that for whatever reason, or not whatever reason, moms take on so much of the bulk of the work. And I'm very grateful to be able to have time to do what I'm doing. But anyway, a lot of it, that's the reason I think I did sit down to Flash is because I could finish something. And I felt, that whole like firstborn, Midwestern introverted person, like I wanted to say I completed something. And so I think that's one of the reasons I fell into Flash as well. And now, and I was a teacher as well, working with a middle school special education student. So like it really was just finding like 30 minutes here or there and just pounding out that 30 minutes and finding out like what I could do in 30 minutes or what I could do in 2 sessions of a thing. Instead of like trying to work on a short story for months and losing the whole frame of like who the character was and what they were doing and all those kind of things. And so that is one of the reasons I think I came. Like I've got a moment. I'm going to write the moment. And sometimes you sit down and nothing comes, or you write a few lines and it's just like I said, I don't have that first line and I'm not good to go. Now I have more time. I'm now working from home full time, running two literary magazines. I'm teaching people flash fiction editing, all that kind of stuff. So I'm fitting it in around other people's words, which is really inspiring to see what
Mm.
everyone else is doing. But there is times when like I'm in full on editing mode, and so
Mm.
like I may not write for 3 or 4 days until I can kind of clear a little bit of the voice of the editor
Yeah. Yeah.
out to get back to my own just creative joy and angst. It's not always a good time.
mostly mostly angst
Yeah,
for
a
me.
lot
Yeah.
of times. Yeah, a lot of angst over here as well. Like I don't sit down and it's just rainbows and butterflies when I'm writing these stories. But so I'm not a writer that writes every day, and a lot of times the pressure builds up, and then I just have to get to the page. My wife always says like, "Oh, you wrote today, didn't you?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'm happier, aren't I?" Like I'm just more balanced, more centered, more in the world now because I'm not like, "Oh my gosh, I need to write." So I don't think you need to write every day. I think you need to do whatever makes sense to you and your process and your system and whatever balances you. Most of us writers, I think, have to write because it does balance or center us in some ways, or it allows us to get stress, tension, or at least different stress and tension out, even though the writing causes its own. Um, so that's kind of, yeah, and I'm still kind of just fitting it in sometimes. Like, I really like. There's times when I'm like, I'm gonna write this outline for this novel, and then I write another flash instead because, like, to think about another project that would take a long time when I could just write a flash. It's just a matter of, yeah, fitting it in, I guess.
Oh, that's fascinating. You've spoken about your involvement as an editor, and you're doing a lot to help other creatives and other folks bring their stories to life. Can you share a bit about that role? I know you mentioned it just for a moment, um, what that actually means, but I'm curious what the day to day looks like as an editor over at Fractured Lit and how you came about doing that.
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. So I've always kind of wanted to like live a literary life in a lot of ways and just be surrounded by writers and read the amazing. Like I've, the way that I learned how to write Flash was by reading amazing Flash writers. So eventually, I kind of realized, like after my MFA, that like, oh, I should probably try to work for a lit journal. Like, I think that'd be really cool to like read the stories as they come in the queue, and have the opportunity to kind of bump some stories up and hope they get published. Um, so I started with a couple of literary journals that kind of like, the first one, which I love the title, is like Girls with Insurance. It doesn't exist anymore, but we got some really cool stuff, and I got to help publish some of that stuff. And then eventually, like, I wanted to do more writing myself, and so like I kind of stopped. And then eventually, I published a story with Split Lip Magazine called God's Eye, and I loved the experience working with the editor there at the time, so much that I was like, "Hey, can I come and be a volunteer reader?" So I went and read for them for a year or two. Um, and I really love their magazine, but a lot of their stuff was very voicey, and so a lot of the stuff that I was pushing up didn't necessarily fit with what they were doing, and so eventually we just kind of parted ways in totally like great amicable way, but it just wasn't working as far as like what I was kind of looking for as a reader in some ways, and I think that's important to know, like when you jive with a lit mag and when you don't. And I think most writers, especially if you're writing Flash or whatever, probably should go and see what happens behind the scenes, and you could just see how many great stories are coming through, and the fact that journals can only take so many. um, Another way that I got a job was I started with Craft, which is a Craft Literary, which is one of the sister sites with a Fractured. It's kind of like a family of literary magazines. Again, I had written a craft essay. The editor worked with me to make it way better than it was. We published it, and I was like, "Hey, by the way, this is great. I'd like to work with you." So then I went and read for them for a while, and then I became their section editor for Flash, and that was exciting because then I was like, it was like me and then the editor in chief, and like we were making decisions about what was being published as the Flash, and I was like, "Oh, this is super exciting." To be able to bring those stories forward and say like we're publishing this as our magazine and we really love them. And then the owners of the company saw that they wanted to do more Flash, and they asked me if I wanted to be editor in chief of Fracture, and I said absolutely. And then they one of the weird things, because most people don't get paid, they said we actually can pay you for this job as well, and I
Oh,
said
wow.
absolutely, I would love to. um, and so we, yeah, started to design Fractured, and Fractured came out April of 2020, which we know is the weirdest of times in all of our lives. Hopefully, it'll be the weirdest time we ever have, and we don't see this kind of thing again. But it was kind of good for me because it helped me to be able to transition from teaching and being really worried about getting COVID. I actually have fibromyalgia, and I was really worried about COVID and what that might do to it and all that kind of stuff. Surprisingly, I still haven't gotten COVID, which is really weird to be. I know because my family's had it and I haven't. It's amazing. Yeah. Um, but it was a good time because lots of people had time to focus on literary things that they might not have had time to focus on before. And so it was a really good time to grow a magazine. It's just amazing to have all these kind of writers put their trust in your magazine and in you to see the value and the work and the joy and the angst that they put into it, and then for people to come back and say that Fractured is one of their dream magazines to be published in is just so gratifying. And I'm a writer, myself. Like I'm still trying to publish myself, and I still deal with a lot of rejection. So it's just one of those things that I love being a part of the community, and we're all doing the same things. Like I get it. Like I understand. Like I started as someone who did not work with a lit journal that was trying to get published, then started working with a lit journal as a volunteer reader with no pay kind of thing, and helping to try to bump up stories that deserve to be read by editors in chiefs until like now I'm an editor in chief, and trying to build the best magazine that we can and to provide as much support to writers as we can. Like we do pay all our writers when we publish. We do have contests with fees, but our payment for the winner is $3,000. That's like 3 times the normal contest thing. So that's one of the things that I'm really excited about with Fractured as well, is that we do work really hard to support and pay writers just like myself, and other writers that we try to be as diverse as possible as well, and try to allow people to tell as many stories as they can.
Oh, that's fascinating and really wonderful of a service that you folks provide over there. I love this idea of the pandemic opening up. The one good thing that came out of the pandemic, at least for me, was that I was able to focus more on those creative pursuits, much like a lot of folks, as you were saying. And I'm really curious to know, for those who are still kind of on the fringes of joining a community, especially an online community, what are some things that you could say to really encourage that haven't already been said about the benefits of branching out, especially if you're a younger person who's starting out and really needs to have that community online?
Yeah, so I think we can kind of go back to the small townness part, right? Like there's not a Flash community here in my small town. Even South Bend, which is an hour away, or Indianapolis, who brings in writers, for talks and those kind of things, is 2.5 hours. So there's not a lot of culture here, and so in a lot of ways, like you had to go online to find that. And at first, Twitter was an amazing place for that. It's not as good as it has been with everything that's going on. Like when I first joined, I was like, why am I doing this? I have nothing to talk about. But then I saw all the writers that were there that were sharing their work and how much easier it was to find amazing things to read, and then amazing ways to connect with these writers. Like you could talk to the person about the story that you had just read. When I first started reading stuff in Smoke Long and Wigleaf, and some other magazines that are no longer here, unfortunately, there was no real way to connect with the writer necessarily. You would read it and love it, and then it'd be like, well, I don't have a blog, so like how do I share this stuff? This was like not super old, but like 2010, 2011. Like or I would write something and you never know like if anyone had read it or not. Like only like the person that was reading that literary magazine every week or every month or whatever, that's what you're hoping for. And now you could not only broadcast your stories to just so many more people than before, but you could build like real unique friendships through the work and through the writing. And one of the other ways that I kind of started to form community, which I really, really wanted, was my own kind of like writing community as well, was I would just share beta reads with people. I just put up there like, hey, I finished a story. Does anyone want to swap on Twitter? And I made lots of, friends that way, lots of colleagues that way. I started to know more about these writers. So like, I would hope that they eventually would send the work to Fractured as well. Like it's all just kind of like there's an ability now to kind of talk to people in ways that we couldn't before. When I first started writing, like the way that I started to learn was I read a lot of interviews, like by Charles Baxter, Tobias Wolff, Elizabeth Strout was one of my favorite writers. Like I would just read all these interviews and kind of like what we're doing now and all that kind of stuff. And that was it. Like it was just me and the page reading about them, and I felt like I knew a lot about them, but like there was no way to connect. And now there are lots of ways to connect. I think some people are trying all kinds of different things like Discord,
Hmm.
and some of these other social medias that may or may not work. I'm trying to stay on Twitter because I've gotten so much good out of it, even though
Yeah,
like it may be falling apart around us. And obviously, I don't condone any of like the hate speech and all that kind of stuff,
right.
which obviously I wish would go away. And it's not fair for anyone to have to experience, but like there are so many bonds and relationships that I've had just by doing that, I guess. At first, like reading interviews and then reaching out to writers. And then now you can reach out to writers on Twitter. I'm very open myself about, writers reaching out to me to talk about their own work, my work, the work they love. It's also how I find, teaching opportunities as well, that I don't know that I would have ways to connect with these writers that I love to work with. I love to help people not only improve like the story they're working on, but like hopefully they'll be able to take it and use it for other stories down the road. And I'm still learning myself. I learn just as much from them as I as they probably hopefully learn from me. Um, And I think the other way, yeah, to be a part of community is, yeah, get involved with the literary magazine and kind of see what's happening in the background. Like if you want to publish, like it's good to know like why people are making the decisions about what they're publishing, why publishing, how much they can publish, how many good things come through that like isn't maybe just the right fit for the magazine at that time, but should go to a different magazine. It's a singular kind of lonely process in a lot of ways. And so like when you can add community to that, if you're interested anyway. Like if you're not and you want to be Cormac McCarthy, like that's fine too. But like if you're looking for community, there are ways I think to form that, create that, curate that, and I hope that I give back just as much as I get, if not more. And I think that's kind of the way I approach life anyway. Is like it's just a service giving kind of mindset, and that's kind of a true way to build a community.
Beautiful. And I got one more question to ask you to be mindful of your time, but Tommy, this has been amazing. You're really giving so much to the community that it's an absolute pleasure to get to talk to you. But lastly, I want to ask you how one goes about quantifying success as a working creative, as somebody who is just out in the world doing the best they can with the time they have, with the resources they have, because it's not about the fame and fortune or whatever in my thinking, but I'm curious what your take is on success and how you quantify it on a day to day basis.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. You're right. It's not fame and fortune, especially when you're when you're writing flash fiction. A lot of times you don't even get paid for the stories that you publish, which is just kind of part of it. Like we don't live in those days when your story would go on the radio or in a magazine and the ads were paying for it, kind of thing. We have so much free content out there, so it's amazing when anyone reads a story, when anyone accepts a story out of the thousands that they get each year. um, so I think each individual kind of has to look at success in their own kind of way. And it's probably not monetary. Like if you love to write or at least need to write, then like hopefully the writing at some point is the success, right? Like the willingness and ability to sit in the chair and do what you need to do, love to do. uh, I think part of the success is finding a way to find some play and joy in your writing time, if possible. I know that's not possible for everyone, but like if you can, I think that's a certain amount of success. I feel a certain amount of success when I finish a draft in a lot of ways. Um, but then publishing it's taken a while, but you kind of have to separate the writing from the publishing. Publishing in a lot of ways is the business part of writing, even if you're not getting paid for it. And just kind of like if you can separate those the best you can and take what solace and joy you can from the writing, and then are willing to do or play the numbers game that is submitting. A playwriting must be even harder because there's only so many outlets of where your play can go. At least for flash or short stories, like there's thousands of lit mags, for better or for worse, right? So we do have a lot of opportunities in that way. I don't know that every writer needs to write a novel. I think I struggle with that all the time, thinking that outside quantitative, like to the people that love me or the strangers. Like I kind of want them to hold my, but like, Raymond Carver never wrote a novel. Andre Dubus never wrote a novel. Deborah Eisenberg, as far as I know, has never written a novel. And I would consider them very successful writers from my point of view, because they did what they loved and they were able to put it out for people to read and hopefully enjoy. And if you're somebody like me, analyze and turn back into ways to write. So this is kind of rambling in some ways, but like, we're not working at a law firm, or if I was a prosecutor like I wanted to be, like my success would have been like on my prosecution rate. I would say like, oh, I'm 75% of winning cases or whatever. I don't have that kind of number for writing. I don't even have that number for like, oh, I want to publish 20 stories a year. I think that some ways that I used to have that idea, like, oh, I just want to publish more than I published before. And then, like you publish 20 once and then you go back to 3 the next year. Is that less successful? Not necessarily if you are doing your best writing, or that you're publishing wit to journals that have an even smaller publication or acceptance rate, or just whatever you can to keep yourself going that makes yourself happy and halfway best success to me. There's also a success for me, like of helping other writers get their work published, and helping them kind of move down their own process and journey, like is a big deal to me. Putting out the best literary magazine that we can either, and helping underrepresented writers as well, and make all of that is just a big ball of success. And that's all just writing. That has nothing to do with like you said, being a father or being a spouse. So the answer is, I don't know.
But to be comfortable in the not knowing is what makes you so damn good at what you do. So thank you so much, Tommy, for everything. This hour went too fast. I have so many things that I would continue to bug you about, but I really want to thank you for the work that you've been doing to serve the writing community online, for being an educator, for lifting other people up, and of course for the tremendous work that you're doing in your chosen form in Flash, which is just this beautiful experience. So I strongly urge folks to check out your Substack, which has been really informative for me. I mean, we didn't even get into that part, but I really can't thank you enough for that. And for being an awesome guy. Thank you so much. This is a pleasure.
Oh, thank you so much. And if you ever want me to come back and we can talk about other things, we could definitely do that. I had such a great time, such good questions. Thank you for providing this for writers and listeners, and them a chance to hear other writers and maybe form community out of that as well. So thank you for doing the podcast.
Awesome, Tommy. Well, I hope that you enjoy the rest of your Sunday. I'll be in touch real soon on the internet, but please take care and all the best to you over there.
Thank you. You too. Happy writing.
You too. Bye.